Michelle, I'm sorry, you are muted. Could you please restart? Sorry.
Yes, so sorry. All right, welcome. Good afternoon. I am Michelle Sano from the Lower Columbia Nature Network, and we are excited to have you here today for our session, Taking Learning Outside, Making the Most of Your School's Outdoor Learning Spaces. These sessions are in partnership with ESD 112, the Lower Columbia School Garden based in Longview, WSU Extension Master Gardener School Garden Coordinator Program, and retired science teacher and school board member Mark Watron, and us, the Lower Columbia Nature Network. So we're excited to bring you this partnership training to you to support your work in outdoor learning. This is session number 2 of 3 in the series. I think probably most of you were at the first session. In these 3 sessions, together with asynchronous learning activities, you can earn up to 6 STEM clock hours upon completion. So this session today is using your outdoor spaces, learning spaces, and we'll hear from Becca Martin in just a few minutes. Our next session on February 28th is Connecting to Classroom Learning, or Connections to Classroom Learning with Mark Watron from the Battleground School District. Then we have another session that is in the planning stages, but you can mark your calendar for March 21st from 4 to 5:30. We have a special guest, John Muir-Laws, for an online training using nature journaling as a tool for outdoor learning. So we'll have more information for you coming about that, but you're all invited to that. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Becca Martin, and we'll hear more. Becca?
Thank you. Well, welcome. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a master gardener here in Clark County. Graduated in the class of 2011. So it's just a little over 10 years. But last year, the Master Gardener program was able to start a pilot program for school garden coordinators. And they hired me to be the coordinator. So this is a new position for me, and I've really enjoyed being able to get into different schools here in the area, primarily in Vancouver School District, a little bit into Evergreen as well. But my role is to help support and resource teachers, staff, parents with the use of their school gardens, as well as hosting school garden tours. So some of the schools that have very established school gardens will be open to being a host site of a tour. And we'll have some of those later this spring that we'll be able to share with those dates with you as they come up. So today I'm covering the basics of school gardens and what it looks like to garden with a school calendar. It's a little bit different than maybe you or I who garden at home. We do have a poll to share before I get started with my presentation. I think Jane can launch that for us. So part of your homework was to find your USDA hardiness zone. So if you want to pop your answer in. Joanne, do you have a question?
Yeah, did you want us to do this in addition to doing it already?
But just if you've already done it, or if you know what your hardiness zone is, could you just go ahead and just give your answer there?
Great, thanks.
This is Andrea Roscoe. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Most of us are going to all land in roughly the same zone. All right, good. We'll give just a little bit more time to answer. So it looks like almost 40% of us are in zone 8B, and then about a third of us are in zone 8A, and there's a few in zone 7B. So very, very good. The majority of Western Washington is in that, or majority of Southwest Washington is at 8A and 8B. And then our second question was, we asked you to research your sunlight their direct sunlight for where your school garden site is, and to see how much sunlight you receive. And it looks like about half of us, here, I'll go ahead and end that. About half of us had 6 to 8 hours of sun per day, which is fantastic. And then 20% had all day sun. And then a quarter of us were in that partial sun. So thank you for sharing that. So we're going to look at some of that and how you use that information to take into consideration with your school garden. Perfect. Okay.
And Becca, just to interrupt really quick, I'm sorry. So there will be an attendance poll later on in the session today. So to get your attendance, we'll share that link later on in the presentation. Thank you.
Well, let's go ahead and dive in and get started with our presentation for today. There we go. So as I said, I'm a school garden coordinator here in Clark County with WSU Extension. It's part of the Master Gardener program, and it is new. It started last April, so the program has been in existence for less than a year. And primarily I have been working with elementary schools in Vancouver and Evergreen School District. And a lot of what I've been doing is helping schools who have gardens in place already, or those that are just kind of in those beginning phases of implementing a garden onto their school grounds. But a school garden can look, or even classroom garden can look different, and it can be many different things. It could be a collection of large pots where you're growing flowers or herbs, or even vegetables. It could be larger containers like the water troughs you see here. It can be, what I see most often are a small group of raised beds, and maybe each raised bed is utilized by a grade level or a classroom. And then there are school gardens that have everything from pollinator gardens to orchards to vegetables, and it runs the gamut of what that space can offer. But what I want you to take a minute to realize and to think about is, regardless of the size or the maturity of how many years your school may have had a garden, or what the size of that garden looks like, what do all of these have in common? And maybe just pop something in the chat box of what would all of these have in common? And there's really no wrong answer. And then maybe Jane can share some of those responses, because I cannot see the chat box very well from where I'm at here.
Sure, we're seeing food, safe places to walk, plants, easy for kids to get to, raised plants, things that are growing, everything's outside. Outdoor engagement opportunities, lots of adequate light, good soil, a sense of community. That's a great one. And things to grow in.
So I guess what I want to emphasize before we really dive too deep is that anything in a container to in the ground, just one or two containers, to many raised beds, to a very large, large square footage, they all can serve the same purpose of giving your students the opportunity to see things grow, to work together as a group, to see, something start as a seed and grow all the way through maturity into a plant. It really does not matter the size. So I guess would encourage you to do not limit yourself to think, well, I don't have, the space to have 6 raised beds, but, start small and it will still serve that same purpose. Today, we're going to look at some general growing information and terminology that I feel is important and would for anyone to know before they start gardening with students, as well as some site considerations. So if you do not have a school garden currently and you're hoping to implement one where you are at, we will look at some things to think about while you choose a site, or if maybe you want to relocate your garden. I noticed that in today's homework, some people are like, well, maybe we need to move our garden based off, the amount of sunlight that I'm seeing we get. We'll also cover how to select crops and plantings for you and your students, as well as taking into the consideration of working within the confines of a September to June school calendar. So some things that are important to know when you're growing is your average last frost date for your area. This comes into play mostly with your vegetable crops as well as your annual flower crops. There's so you would want to research that. For Clark County, that's typically middle of April is when we get our last frost, but I underlined average there because it does not always hold true. Last year, just before the middle of April, we had 8 inches of snow here in Battleground. So Mother Nature does not always play by, the stats that we've been tracking, but it will be helpful to know that as you're planning your garden. You also want to know your USDA hardiness zone, and that was part of your homework. Essentially what that is it is a number that you'll often see on plant tags, or if you're researching plants, it will say, good for zones 8A and above, or zones, it'll tell you what zone that plant can grow in. And those zones are based off of the, again, average annual minimum winter temperatures, and those are divided into 10-degree increments. So the majority of our area, like I said earlier, Southwest Washington, is either a zone 8A, which has a 10 to 15 degree Fahrenheit minimum winter average, or 8B, which is 15 to 20 degrees. And those minimum degree temperatures go down as the zone number decreases. So zones 6, 5, and such, those are going to have lower temperatures. And then if they go up, those numbers are 9, 10, then those minimum temperatures are higher. But that number is not the end all of your planning. It's important to, it's just one piece, because we need to consider the fact that, like, there's areas in South Carolina and Georgia and Texas and Arizona that are also zones 8A and 8B, but their growing areas are going to be different. So when you're seeing gardening information, take into account where that information is coming from, and also think about our own climates and what we need to know about those. So the Pacific Northwest, we have, so much rain through the fall and the spring, but then it's very dry in the summer versus, if you were getting information from Georgia and another gardener who's growing in a zone 8, their summers are going to look a lot different than ours. They might have more rain or more humidity or those kinds of things. So also in a school, I would want to be aware of possible microclimates. So we have our standard Pacific Northwest climate, which is going to be, like I said, rainy in the fall, rainy in the spring, rainy in the late spring. Sometimes we do obviously get snow and ice, and then in the summer it is very, very dry. But there are also microclimates. And in schools, the ones I specifically see would be when you have gardens that are near, either on pavement or near buildings. Those are going to be warmer than other areas on the school campus. And then there could also be cold spots. If a building casts a shadow for a long part of the day, then that area, the frost will remain longer than other parts of the school grounds. So pay attention to your garden area and does it stay colder than other areas, or is it hotter than other areas, or is there not a wind break so that there's more wind coming through that area? Just things you need to be observant when you're gardening. And then also thinking about with your school garden, do you want to have a mix of annuals and perennials, so that an annual is something you would plant every year, and then it would go through its cycle and then be finished, and it would not come back the following year, whereas perennials will continue to come back every year. So when you're planting a school garden, you might want some perennials in there so that there's less planting for you to do, and there'd be something that's maybe there in the winter if you planted perennials that are evergreen, or perennials that have nice branching patterns that are interesting to look at in the winter. And then annuals would be, your flowers like pansies and snapdragons and sunflowers, those kinds of things. With some other things that are important to know is that some seeds require certain soil temperatures for germination, and your seed packets will often tell you what temperature that you need to be at, or at least what time of year, and then generally that time of year your soil is at that temperature. So a soil thermometer is a very inexpensive tool that you can have for your classroom to use, and you can start testing the soil temperature, say middle of March. If your class plans to plant carrots, for example, and you guys have researched and you know that the soil needs to be 50 degrees or warmer for the carrot seeds to germinate, we'll start putting your soil thermometer in the soil and see when does that soil warm up enough to have the carrot seeds planted so that they'll germinate. Another thing to consider is whether or not you want to direct seed or transplant. And there's pros and cons to each of those. Direct seed is fantastic when you're working with students. If you're using larger seeds, it's great for a student to be able to put the seed in the ground, into the soil, and then see the entire process of it growing from, germinating as a seed into a young seedling, into a plant, into whatever vegetable or flower you're growing. But when you do have direct seeds, it's important to remember that you need to monitor how much water they're getting, that they're not getting too much water or too little water, because they need consistent moisture to germinate. Positive to direct seeds is you have a million choices as far as varieties, versus if you purchase transplants from a garden center, you only have the choice of what they're offering there on their shelves. Some benefits to transplanting would be that when you direct seed and those seeds germinate, they are birds and other pests are really going to want to come and feast on those young new seedlings. And when you have an established transplant, it tends to fare a little better against birds and squirrels and pests and such. So that is a bonus when using transplants, as well as, when you direct seed, you may need to thin down your plants to the correct spacing. And so it's a little extra work when you do transplants. You're putting them in at the spacing they need to be from the beginning. Some crops for direct seeding with students would be peas or beans or your squashes, cucumbers, melons. Those are all sunflower seeds, nasturtium flowers. Those are all really good sized seeds for little hands to use. And then you can do transplants of other types of flowers and vegetables if you'd like. When you're choosing a site for a school location, if you don't have a site already in use, there's a lot of different things that you need to consider. You want adequate sunlight based on what you're choosing to grow. So if you're choosing to grow vegetables, you primarily would want that full sun. So 6, 8, 10 hours of direct sun per day in the growing season. If you're having a school garden that maybe is growing other things, more shrubs, trees, those kinds of things, then you can make selections for the amount of sunlight that you have. So paying attention to how much sunlight is in a given area that you want to garden in, and then you can choose your plants appropriately from there. You're going to obviously want to have healthy soil, and we'll talk about what healthy soil looks like. Water access is a big one, especially in schools. Is there a hose spigot nearby, or is there a key that the maintenance person needs to unlock that water access? That's important to know. You're going to want good airflow for your plants. So like I said earlier, if you have a building that's maybe causing a windbreak, some plants will suffer if there's not enough air coming through, and drying them off after heavy rains, those kinds of things. You can have different fungus issues and things like that. You also want to set up your garden in a way that is convenient to plant, to care for, and to harvest. So if you are designing a raised bed garden, for example, and you're thinking about your students being the primary gardeners, it is their space, you do not want a garden bed that is so wide that they can't reach into the middle of the bed to harvest something. So even though, most commonly we would see maybe a 4x8 raised bed, which for an adult reaching into the center of a 4-foot wide bed is very manageable. For a young student, you might want to scale those bed sizes down to be smaller so that they can have full access to the beds. So the sun is very important for plant growth, especially, like I said, with anything that's a food producing crop needs sunlight. So part of your homework was to determine the number of hours of sunlight in a given area. I had suggested one website that you can use. There are other apps and such that you can use. You can also use your students and have them go out and record, like set aside, 1 hour a day to walk outside and look, is that area receiving sunlight or not? And do that throughout the school year as part of your planning for an upcoming school garden site. Knowing how much sun you get will then help you select the best plants. So, and it's important, sometimes you'll see, a plant tag that says good for full sun or good for partial sun. Well, what does that really mean? So full sun by definition in the plant world would mean 6 or more hours of direct, unfiltered sunlight. So that means there's not a tree shading that area at a certain point of time, but it is direct sunlight. Partial sun is 4 to 6 hours per day. And it's also, you would want to know what time of day is your growing area receiving that sun. So is it 6 to 8 or 10 hours of sun starting in the morning and going through into the afternoon? Or is that direct sun starting at lunchtime and going through into the evening? The sun is going to be warmer in the afternoon. The heat has, the heat's risen. So that area will be hotter than an area that receives direct sunlight starting in the morning. So for example, at my house, I have a flower bed on the west side of my house. So in the morning, it is in complete shade, but by late afternoon, it is receiving hot sun. So I've had to be very selective and choosing very hardy, sun-loving plants that can take that hot afternoon sun up against my house. So just paying attention to the time of day that that site receives sun is good as well. For food crops, you're going to want closer to the 8 or more hours of sunlight. If you found that your area receives more like 5 or 6 hours of sunlight, there are plenty of plants to choose from. And I wanted to include a list of these, especially if you're interested in growing vegetables, but you know that your area is only partial sun. Leafy greens would be fantastic. They're also a good choice because you can grow them in the spring and your students will be able to harvest them before they go home for summer break. Root vegetables are another good choice. So that would be your radishes, beets, carrots, those kinds of things. Brassicas, so your broccolis and such, cauliflowers, those are a good choice for partial sun areas. There are plenty of herbs that do well. And then flowers too. Impatiens, petunias, sweet alyssum, those are all fine choices for those partial sun areas with your school gardens. You can try growing other things, and it'd be a great experiment to have the same plant in a partial sun location and then in a full sun location and see what the differences are. Often, if a full sun plant, like say, strawberries would do best in full sun. They can tolerate a little bit of partial sun, but you'll notice if you do a side-by-side comparison, the strawberries grown in full sun will produce more berries than those that have been grown in partial sun. So it'd be a good experiment for your students. Looking at your soil that you will be growing your plants in is important so that you know what you're dealing with. You want soil that's going to drain well. You do not want to have standing water. It's really difficult for roots. If there's standing water throughout the year, it can cause root rot and different issues like that. So what I encourage you to do, especially this is a prime time of year to be looking for this, but after we've had some heavy rains, go out to the site where you're proposing to have a garden. Is there standing water there? And then go out the next day. Is the standing water still there or has it drained through? If the standing water persists over a number of days, then that will not be a good location. The water will be too saturated for the roots of the plants. Another thing to do is to stick a shovel in the ground and investigate, is the soil rocky? If it's rocky, that doesn't mean it's the end of the world for as a growing site, but you may want to consider raised beds if you're doing annual crops that have finer root systems, or you may want to consider more shrubs and trees that have larger root systems and can tolerate some rocky soils. Another thing are weeds. Just because you might see weeds in the area, that's actually a good sign. That means that the soil can support plant life. So do not see the weeds as like, oh, this must be a terrible location for my garden. But if the weeds are there, then the soil has nutrients to support those weeds. It does mean you might have some work in getting rid of the weeds, but students are a great weed pullers. So you can put them to let them identify the weeds and research them and then pull them. Another thing to consider in school gardens would be whether or not you need to do a soil test. If it's a new area and you're not very familiar with how that space has been used over time, and if you're planning to garden in ground, you might want to consider getting a soil test. The Master Gardener program has a great handout on how to do a soil test collection. You collect over multiple places or multiple spots in that given area and mix them all together, and then you send it off to a lab. So if you're interested in pursuing a soil test, I'll have my contact information at the end of the presentation, and you can email me and I will send you our handout on how to do a soil test and where we recommend sending it to. It's a lab here in the area. It costs roughly $30 on average. And then they'll tell you what you need to amend your soil with based off of what you plan to grow. So they're very helpful. If you're gardening in raised beds, so it's been a bulk mix from a landscape supply, it's probably not necessary to do a soil test if that's a brand new bed. But if it's been an ongoing bed that you've maybe been using for a number of years, you might consider doing a soil test, because if you've added different amendments and such over the years. So, yeah. And then lastly, if you're gardening in a new location and the soil's like not 100% where you want it, it doesn't, maybe if it feels like it's too much clay or too much sand, you can amend your soil with compost. And over time, over many years of small amounts of compost being incorporated into that soil, you can help the soil become less sand or less clay through the use of the compost and the organic matter and their breaking down and the bacterial and microbial activity that goes on in the soil. So, and I want to address gardening in raised beds, because I do see a lot of schools that utilize raised beds for gardening, and they're fantastic to use with students. They're great because they define spaces for, like, this is Mrs. Smith's class's garden bed and this is Mr. Anderson's garden bed. And so it's fantastic for those types of things. But that soil needs to be amended, and just as much as, in-ground garden beds need to be amended. In raised beds, you'll still have soil compaction, because over time the weight of soil will cause some compaction. A student may step in it on accident. You're going to have loss of soil when you harvest your crops, as well as you will have nutrient depletion over time, because the crops and the flowers that you're growing in those beds will have utilized the nutrients that were available, and they need to be replaced. So that's something to consider with your school gardens, is putting into your plan that you need to remember to amend your raised garden beds each year. And also, if your bed started with a soil mix most soil mixes that you get from a landscape supply company contain sand. So if you had a raised bed that started with a 3-way mix or a 4-way mix, usually one of those 3 or 4 ways parts is sand. And so you do not want to add more of those bulk mixes into your raised beds, because the organic matter in those mixes will break down over time, but the sand does not break down. It's always there. So if you continually add a three-way mix to replenish any lost soil in your beds, eventually over time, you'll have far too much sand in your raised beds. So I hope that's clear, but I just want to make sure. So if you do start with any sort of blended mix from the landscape supply company and sand was part of it, then for future amendments, you would always just amend with compost typically. So in the late fall, you would want to add a layer 1 to 2 inches of compost on your beds, and that will help with your soil loss. It will help replace organic matter that has decomposed. It will help replace nutrients that were utilized by the plants that had been growing there that season. And then I always add a layer of mulch over the top of the compost. And so you'll see in this photo here, we were in the process of adding compost to the beds, and then I had straw on hand, so we mulched with straw. You can certainly mulch with leaves in a lot of school yards. If you have large deciduous trees, you can have students rake up the leaves and add those as a top layer of mulch over the garden beds. It's like putting the beds to bed for the winter. You can also use grass clippings that have not been treated. If you've used grass clippings or leaves, then in the spring, you can turn those into the soil and they'll continue to break down. If you do use straw, you'll want to rake it back and either leave it on the soil, but rake it away so that you can plant into it, or you can remove it entirely and put it into the compost. I usually just move it aside and then plant into the layer of straw. Another option would be to use landscape fabric to cover the beds, so you don't have weed seeds being blown into the beds or anything else disturbing the soil, but you do want to cover the soil with something over the winter. A good question too to consider is where to source your compost. It seems that not every school location is able to compost on site, and depending on how many beds you have, you could need a lot of compost to provide that 1 to 2 inches. So you can call around. There's many different landscape supply companies here in the Southwest Washington area, but I would recommend you go and see what the compost looks like. If it's a really woody, heavy, large pieces of woody debris in the compost, that's not the best choice for your vegetable or annual beds. But if you have a garden area that is more trees and shrubs and perennials, then that type of compost will be fine. But you'll want a finer compost that's been has broken down more, has composted more. Also, if you find a compost that has kind of a still has a strong smell to it or really high heat, then that hasn't finished breaking down entirely either. And you can still utilize that compost, but I wouldn't plant in it right away. It might be too hot still for young seedlings. So you can spread it and then allow it to sit for a few weeks before you plant in it. If you can compost on site, then that's fantastic, because then you have everything right there and there's not an additional cost each year when you amend your beds.
Becca, real quick, there's a question in the chat. What if we miss the fall timeframe to amend soils? Can we wait till spring to amend?
Yeah, and adding compost can be done year round. I'm actually going to a school garden tomorrow, and we're going to be clearing out the beds and amending them now. Over the winter, when you've put the compost on, it's pretty much just sitting there. A lot of that microbial activity isn't happening because the soil's too cold, but then as the soil warms up, things start to perk up and get moving around and stuff. So it's not too late. There's really, so you can keep adding compost throughout the year. You do want to make sure you don't, keep it within that 1 to 2 inches, because there is a point of overdoing it when it comes to adding organic matter. Does that answer the question?
Thank you.
Perfect. So the other thing I'd mentioned is when you're choosing a site is water. Water is very important when it comes to our gardens. You can, if you have difficult access to water, you can certainly plant a garden that is more drought tolerant. And there are some fantastic plant choices that are low water or to very little water once established. But even those, when you are establishing those gardens in the first couple of growing seasons, those will still need supplemental water. So you do need to have access to water. At the school, you'll need to know where is your water source. Some of the newer schools have had gardens put in, and those gardens may have soaker hoses or sprinkler systems incorporated into the beds, but you need to know how to use them and who turns them on and how much water is being put out by those. So really get to know what is there, what is available, who manages it, and ask some questions. If you're doing watering just by turning on a spigot, that's a fantastic way for students to water too. They can utilize watering cans and water individual plants. It's a very easy way for them to measure how much water plants are getting. Soaker hoses are a great efficient way to not use too much water. When you're watering by hand with watering cans, you want to water at soil level, not water the entire plant, but water at the soil level so that you're not wasting water. You obviously don't want to water pathways and that kind of thing. Sprinkler systems would be the ideal because, they're the most efficient. But I think with students, if you can water by hand for at least part of the season, it really connects them to the plants that they're growing. So I think that's important for them to see that and be a part of that. A question I often get is how much water. I always hear this, an inch of water per week is good for plants. And that is a good general rule of thumb, but sometimes, some plants need a little bit more water than that. Typically, our fruits and vegetables grown in our gardens, they're made up mostly of water, so they need a lot of water. Their roots are in that top 18 inches of soil. So however you water, you need to make sure that the water is spreading throughout the soil and into that top 18 inches. And you can measure this by using a tuna can. So if you're overhead watering with a watering can, you can know how much you're watering by having a tuna can out there and seeing that's about 1 inch deep. You can use a rain gauge as well, which would be important in our spring and fall to know how much rain has been coming down, to know if you need to supplemental water. It's also your best thing to do is to dig into the soil with a hand trowel and dig down a bit and see, is the water that I've been pouring on with the watering can actually getting down into this lower portion of the soil? So dig in there and find out, does it feel damp? When you're doing direct seeding and you need to keep that soil moist, or when you have new transplants and you want to keep the soil moist, you want the soil to feel a bit like a wrung out sponge. So you don't want it to be too wet, but you don't want it to be too dry either. So I always think of like a wrung out sponge as my good moisture meter. And lastly, the mulch. So mulch can be a variety. You can use a variety of different things for mulch. I'd mentioned earlier, leaves, grass clippings, straw, compost can be a mulch. But when you're gardening in the late fall, you can put over that layer of mulch to protect the soil. But even in the growing season, you can utilize mulch to your benefit. It helps keep the soil temperature consistent for your plants. It helps prevent weeds. It holds in moisture. So all the watering that you're doing, that mulch will help keep that moisture in instead of evaporating out into the air. If you're gardening in ground, it protects the soil from runoff. Some mulches will benefit the soil by feeding it as it decomposes over time. And it saves you time. If you've mulched your garden beds, then there's less weeds, which is less work for you and your students. So, and you can, yes.
I'm sorry, we had a question in the chat. If your grass had been treated with any of your plant materials been treated with a weed killer, is it still okay to use as your mulch?
No, I would not. And that's a really good question. So and this is where school gardens have an abundance of grass clippings, but they're often treated. Those herbicides that are used on the grass to help prevent dandelions and such, those would they can have a negative effect on your plants in your vegetable or flower gardens. So unfortunately, no, we cannot use those in our gardens. If you're at home, if you mow your lawns and collect the grass clippings and they're not treated, you can bring those to your garden and put them, spread them in a layer. But as far as I know, most school districts do treat the school lawns with something. So they cannot be used.
Thank you.
Yeah. So crop selection. So if you have your site picked out or you already have your location, how do you choose crops with your class? So I always like to ask the kids, what do you enjoy to eat? And just anything goes, like whatever fruits, vegetables, what kind of flowers do they like? Just let them brainstorm everything. And then let us start. And then it's a great chance for us to talk about, okay, so what do we know about our area? And what do we know about, like, say somebody said, oh, I love oranges. I want to grow oranges. Okay, well, let's research. What does an orange need? And can our area provide that for an orange? Maybe your school has a greenhouse and you can find ways to make these work. But for the most part, we don't have the right climate for that. But it's a great way for them to start noticing, like, what is our area like? What are other parts of our nation like? What grows in different parts? Different states are known for producing different things. So it's a good chance for them to be aware of what we have and what we can do here, which is quite a bit, and maybe some other areas what they can grow. And then also for students who are like, oh, I don't know about vegetables, I'm not really a big fan. It's a great time for them to be a little bit adventurous and try something different. Often if they've grown it, they are more willing to try it. Doesn't necessarily mean they will like it, but they will at least give it a shot. So it's really fun for students to be able to do that. You also want to consider your site and time limitations. So if your class really wants to grow tomatoes, tomatoes require some mid-season pruning to make them super productive. So would you have the time to come to the school grounds in July and prune those tomato plants? So think about those kinds of things as you're choosing which crops you're going to want to grow. So once you have decided, maybe started to narrow it down, and you have a list with your class of things you want to grow, you're going to need to know how to go about doing that. Thankfully, seed packets have so much information fit onto the back of them that you pretty much have everything there that you need to know. This is a great example of a very detailed seed packet. Not all of them have quite all this information. It would be great if they did, but you typically will find a description of the plant. It will tell you whether it's best to direct seed or transplant. So for example, in this pepper, they recommend that you start it indoors. And so this would not be a good candidate in our area for starting it direct seeded outside. You're gonna have to start inside and then transplant it outside. It will tell you when to plant. So there will be a map of the area, and you can find, where's Washington State? Where are we in Washington State? Okay, we're in the orange there. That means we're planting peppers somewhere in late May. So it has that information there. It will tell you how deep to plant the seeds, how far apart to space the seeds, how much sun it's going to need, and then the days to maturity, or the number of days to harvest, which when you're planning with your students, you can kind of count back, like, okay, if we want to plant a garden, so we're eating some of this before we leave for summer break, and we want to harvest the first week of June, count backwards and see, will this particular vegetable be harvestable? Will this flower be blooming by then? So count backwards and see. The case with carrots, most of them take about 65 to 70 days to mature, and the soil needs to be 50 degrees for the seeds to germinate, which is not going to be happening until sometime after spring break. So if you were to take those two pieces of information and look at your school calendar, you may not have a carrot that is ready to be harvested by the time school lets out. But if you look in your seed catalogs or go to the garden center and look at all the different carrot varieties that are available, you can find ones that are ready to harvest in about 55 days. And that extra 10 or 15 days buys you the time that you need for your students to be able to plant them and harvest them before the end of the school year. So paying attention to that days to maturity will really help when you're trying to plan around the school calendar. You'll also see, I've noticed lately on a lot of seed packages, it'll tell you if it's container friendly. The bulk of our flowers and our vegetables can be grown in containers, but so it'll tell you if it's can be utilized in a container, what size of container, and how how many you can plant into that given container. So you're going to want to know the space that you have to grow as you plant your crops. So you want to measure the square footage, which would be very applicable to many of your math lessons with some of your older grade school students. So figure out how much space you have, and then take that wish list of plants and flowers and vegetables that you want to grow and determine, do you have the space to grow all of those? You might need to be selective. Crowded plants are not successful plants. So you might need to take your wish list and kind of narrow it down a little bit. It's a great chance for you to talk to your students about, like, why would plants need more space? What does this do for them? How do you feel in a crowded environment? Do you feel a little uncomfortable and not yourself? Plants are no different. They want that space. They need that good airflow. They need the availability of nutrients in the soil. If you've crowded them, there's not enough nutrients available for them. Water, all of those things that plants need. I will say that there have been more and more patio varieties, is usually how they're labeled, or dwarf varieties of different plants and vegetables. So if you're growing in a smaller space, look for some of those that are labeled that are good for smaller growing locations. And then you'll be able to fit more plants into smaller spaces because the plants don't get as big. There's cucumbers and zucchinis and tomatoes, and even into some of the shrubs and trees, you can find dwarf varieties that stay smaller. So if you look out there at the different nurseries and plant catalogs, you'll find a lot available for small growing spaces. And then if you don't have a garden, use containers, and anything can be a container as long as it has drainage holes. So you can use, a standard growing container, but you can use 5-gallon buckets. You can use the water, like the metal water troughs. You can use, the bakeries have the plastic pails. Sometimes you can pick those up for free. Just make sure that you've put some drainage holes in whatever you use so there isn't standing water in it. Containers do also dry out more quickly than in-ground planting, so you'll need to check more frequently to make sure that they're staying moist. And when it is very hot in the summer, they will often need watering every single day. With containers, it's possible. Like this one is on wheels. I've grown in these containers before. They're pretty handy. You could consider starting a garden with your students and then bringing that container home so it's easier to monitor over the summer, and then bringing it back in the fall. When you are growing in containers, you'll still fertilize your vegetables, but often it's recommended to use a diluted solution that you apply more frequently. And the suggested seed or plant spacing still applies even in containers. So don't pack them in even tighter, at least if you're growing fruits and vegetables. If you're growing annual flowers, it is kind of nice to pack them in a little bit tighter. It makes the container more colorful, but it would be wise and best practice to follow the suggested planting spacing. I want to also note that when you are growing in containers, that growing media is going to supply the roots with their nutrients, air, and water. It'll allow for maximum root growth, and it needs to physically support the plant. It needs to, have that stability so that as the plant grows, it's supported. So you're going to want to use products that are labeled for containers. They're usually labeled as soilless or potting mix or container mix. For all of ours, especially like if you're growing 5-gallon buckets or large planting pots, it's not wise to add native ground soil into those containers. It's just too heavy and it doesn't work the same as when it's in the ground. So you're going to want to buy some of these bagged soils. You can look up like a DIY, make your own container mix, and you can purchase all the individual ingredients, or you can purchase a bagged product that's labeled for containers. But if you are growing in a very large container, like one of the water troughs, you can do a little bit of native soil, but only if you're growing in something quite large. And I wouldn't add more than 25% of your native ground soil to those containers. So school gardens. Schools, when we grow, especially vegetables or fruits or flowers, a lot of times when we think about those things and when we're harvesting them, it's July and August, and that's when summer break is happening. So unless you have a year-round school environment or you have a summer program that happens on your school grounds, there are some extra things to think about when you're planning how to garden with your students in the school year. Also, space is a big consideration when you're planning, elementary school can have 400 or 500 students. So how do you best utilize that space? So this square foot gardening, some of you may have already heard about this before. It is a method of intensive planting that can be done either in ground or raised beds. This is an example of it was 4 raised beds at Truman Elementary in Vancouver School District. This was at their before they built their new building. But we had utilized this. Each classroom had a raised bed, and the kids measured out their beds. They marked out 1 foot increments. They used pieces of twine, and we stapled and created a grid across the top of the bed. So in a 4x8, these were donated pre-built garden beds. So they were 4x8. That left 32 spaces. So that meant every student was able to plant their own square foot of the garden. And that was great for the students to utilize. And then those extra spaces, because there were only 22 to 25 kids in the class, we planted some flowers in the beds as well. So each square can be planted with a different crop. It does not mean you need to have 32 squares filled with all radishes. You can mix it up a little bit, and I would encourage you to. Something that I remember about this garden is that because we had all these crops mixed up, and every bed was planted with peas and lettuce and carrots and all the things, instead of having 1 bed of carrots and 1 bed of peas and 1 bed of spinach, but they were all mixed up. One of the beds during the spring had been hit really hard with aphids, and their peas suffered from it. But then in the 3 other beds where they were also growing peas, the aphids hadn't made it over there. So then when we harvested at the end of the school year, that still meant that all the kids who were participating got to have some of the peas, because we had them in other beds as well. Instead of had we only had the peas in 1 bed, then it would have been a possibility that the aphids could have, really damaged an entire bed's worth of the vegetable we were growing. You can look online. There's books at the library. There's a square foot gardening book that is written with kids in mind. I think it's called Square Foot Gardening with Kids. But typically the way that it works out is your plants are seeded as 1 per square foot, 4 per square foot, 9 or 16 seeds to a square foot based on the needs of those plants. So if a plant needs to be, 1 every 2 inches, they can, according to the seed packet, it would tell you, okay, you can put this many to a square foot. I would advise, though, that sometimes these plantings are a little too intensive. They're too close. The plants grow, they're really vigorous, and we have great weather condition here, and you might find that they're a little crowded and you may need to thin them down a little bit. But this is a good guideline to follow if you want to do the square foot gardening. Something else to consider when gardening in a school environment is to sow early and harvest early. Just because we often, as home gardeners, or maybe you grew up helping someone, a grandmother or your mom garden, and you remember picking tomatoes in August, that doesn't mean that you can't have a garden that is started and finished by June. If you plan with some cool season crops, so some spring season crops, then you can you can start your garden about mid-March with some of your vegetables and keep planting into middle of April. And then they would grow for their 6 to 8 weeks, and you can harvest by the end of May. And then you'd be able to put the garden to bed for summer if you wanted. So there are there are many different vegetables you can choose from to do this. So radishes, spinach, peas, beets, and carrots can all be direct seeded. Starting, radishes and peas can be started in middle to late March. Carrots, you're going to need to wait maybe till after spring break when your soil warms up a little bit. But those can all be put in as seeds. I would recommend another great project to do with your students in the winter when it's cold and rainy is to make seed tape. And carrots are a good one for this because carrot seeds are minuscule. And even though, we have the dexterity to manage these little carrot seeds, every time I go to plant them, if I go outside, that's as soon as the wind is going to pick up and blow these seeds everywhere. So even I make seed tape for myself, but it's a good project for students. You can take a strip of newspaper, you can take toilet paper, you can take paper napkins, paper towels, and Elmer's glue. And you would glue your seeds every couple of inches and put a little drop of glue, put your seeds on there and let it dry. And then when it's planting day, you can take those outside, lay your seed tape on the soil in the bed, sprinkle the 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch of soil over the top of the seeds, and that whatever thin paper, toilet paper, newspaper that you've used will disintegrate over time and the seeds will germinate beautifully. So it's a good winter project for you and your students, and then you'll be ready to plant when the soil warms up. For our early season plantings, you can also use starts. Now they will give you a head start in that, kale and lettuce and onions and things that take either maybe need a little bit warmer weather to get going or take a little longer to grow. If you utilize starts of those plants, then you'll be able to harvest them by that end of May, beginning of June time. Herbs make a great addition to your garden and can be harvested early in the season, and then a lot of them you can leave them over the season. Some of them are perennials that would come back every year anyways. Mint is a great herb to grow with students and it will come back, but I put an asterisk there to remind you it will overtake your garden. So if you're going to grow mint with your students, grow it in a container or put some sort of boundaries on it because it will take over. It's an amazingly vigorous plant. Then also I would include flower starts. It's hard to start flowers from seed and see them blooming by the time school lets out. So if you want your students to have some flowers in their garden for the spring, I would use starts in this instance. Pansies and alyssum, snapdragons, you can probably find marigolds in the springtime, but utilizing starts will allow them to have those blooms and also will help invite pollinators into your garden. And I just think it's a nice colorful addition when you pop some flower starts in and the rest of your garden has just been seeded. It at least gives you something to look at besides the soil. Something to think about for your school gardens is what will you do in the summer months? Would you have physical access to the garden? Some school properties are gated and you don't have access to maintain the gardens. Is there going to be water available in the summer months? Or do you have enough volunteers to maintain the beds? Because if it's just you doing it, that's a big task for one or two people to do. So some things to consider would be, like we've just discussed, having a spring only garden that you then, once it's harvested end of May, beginning of June, put it to bed. Clean it all out of all the plants you're growing. You can leave the flowers and see how they do over the summer, but clean out all your vegetables. Put a layer of compost on and put a layer of straw over it and walk away. There's no watering that needs to be done. There's no maintenance. There's no weeding. It's done. You could also have a family from the school. If you do have water access and site access, you can have a family from the school adopt a bed for the summer. One of the elementary schools I worked with this spring chose to do this. So their classes were growing vegetables in the spring. And then in June, the family who adopted those beds, there were 6 or so families, they got to take over the beds and plant what they wanted to plant. So then they could grow, their tomatoes and peppers and such. And they got to take care of their beds and harvest and take home what they grew through the summer. And then when September came around, the students took the beds back over. So that's something to consider. As well as you can just have a rotation of volunteers and work party days in the summer if you want to have your garden going through those summer months. And then maybe your volunteers and those who show up get to take a portion of the produce, and then maybe you donate some of the produce to a local organization like a food bank or something. You can also consider how to plant for September so that when your students come back to school, there's something going in the garden. So before school lets out for summer, you can choose to plant some potatoes. You can plant pumpkins or winter squash, and then that's when you can plant some flowers by seed. And then when they come back in the fall, they'll be blooming. So potatoes there are early and mid varieties, taking about 60 to 90 days. So depending on when you're planting them, take that into account, whether you choose an early or a mid variety, and they're often labeled. And then there's also late season varieties. So if you're trying to plan this where you're planting in late May and you want to harvest with your students in September, choose an appropriate variety. Pumpkins and winter squashes like Hubbards and delicatas and butternuts, those can be planted in the end of May, beginning of June, and then they'll be ready to be harvested in October. So that's a really fun one. Maybe let your kindergartners plant the seeds, and then when they come back as first graders, they can harvest them. And then your zinnias, cosmos, marigolds, sunflowers, nasturtium, those are fantastic fall flowers. And those are pretty easy for students to plant. Sunflowers and nasturtium are nice large seeds for your younger primary grades. Zinnias, cosmos, and marigolds are a little bit smaller seeds, so maybe have your upper grades plant those. But you can plant those towards the end of the school year and have those blooming in September. When you come back to prep your classroom at the end of the summer, you can pop some things into the garden as well, and then they'd be ready for your students by September. So middle of August is not too late to start a fall garden. So you can direct seed lettuce, peas, or basil, or you can put some flower starts in. And in September, when your students have come back, you can seed radishes again, because they only take about 28 days at the most from start to finish before you harvest them. And you can also add some lettuce starts back in. I would want to remind you that when you're planting in late season like this, it is still very, very warm, and often the soil dries out pretty quickly. So you'll need to remember to water those, especially the direct seeded plantings, because those seeds, the soil needs to stay moist for them to germinate. So just keep that in mind. You might be watering every day in the summer because we're not getting, that's not when we're often getting any rain. So this is a lot of information, and where do you go from here? I always recommend that you start small. Choose, whether it's literally a small space or whether you start small by just choosing one or two things that you're going to grow with your class. But start small and have some successes with it. And as you gain confidence, add more. It's a lot less overwhelming, and it's a lot less stressful when you can start with some of the small things and then go from there. And then just try and try and try again. I've been gardening for many, many years, and there are still some things that are challenging for me. And every year I'm like, okay, this is my new challenge. I'm going to try this year and see how I do. And some years will be successful, and other years I'm like, okay, well, that was a learning experience. And what did I learn? And what can I try again next year? So don't be afraid to do that with your students. Model that the ability to learn from, we don't have control over the weather, and there's so many things that can happen in a garden, the pests that could arrive, or the weather that we have, or, a neighbor's cat that gets into the garden, whatever it is, but you get to learn with them and model, like, how do you navigate that? And what do you do moving forward from there? I also want to recommend that you utilize regional vetted sources for information. When planning things for working with students, there's so many fantastic ideas out there, and so many teachers have done amazing things, and Pinterest has awesome, really very cool looking things. But it's important that if you're growing plants, that you can maybe take that idea, but then make sure that it is a plant or a flower or a vegetable variety that will grow well where you're growing. So a lot of our universities, WSU, Oregon State University, a lot of our regional universities will have really good information for free for you online. And then also there's, plenty of great local authors that you can find that would speak to gardening here in the Northwest, as well as your local nurseries. Wherever you live, if you have a local independent nursery, that'll be a great source of information for you. And then ask questions. If your neighbor is an avid gardener, ask them, what are they doing? Which variety of such and such do they grow? And why do they grow that one? And you'll be able to learn a lot from others around you. So that is pretty much what I have for you. And I wanted to make sure to leave some time for questions. This is my email. So if you had any additional questions that maybe come up over the next few days, or even as the spring goes on, feel free to get in touch with me. If I don't know the answer, I'm happy to look into it and research it for you. That's kind of what I'm here for. But I just really want to thank you for the time, and we'll go ahead and do some questions. I'll give you just a minute to jot that down if you need to.
Thank you, Becca. And feel free to
Yeah.
type that into the chat if you'd like. I'm taking you off
Oh.
spotlight.
Good idea. I will do that.
Thank you. And hi, everybody. I'm Jane Tesner-Kleiner. I'm the program manager for the Lower Columbia Nature Network. And we're super excited that you all joined us today. I also did put in the chat box the attendance poll for today. So you have until the end of the week. If you could fill that in at your convenience, we'll make sure you get credit for attending today. But with that, we're going to offer, feel free to either raise your hand and I'll make sure I monitor the boxes as best I can, or unmute yourself if you have a question specifically for Becca. I'll start with Becca. There was one other question in the chat box about what type of glue to make sure that we're not adding toxins.
Oh, yes. So Elmer's glue works fantastically. You can also do a paste of flour and water. But I figure I don't know a single classroom that doesn't have access to Elmer's glue, so it's pretty easy to use.
Thank you. And I think Ian put a recipe in the chat box for the flour water ideas.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
So feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question for Becca.
I have a question. How often do you need to replace found that you need to replace your raised beds? Because I noticed most of them are out of wood. And are you using treated wood or not?
A lot of the raised beds I've seen have been using cedar, but I know some people, I haven't seen it at schools, but I know other homeowners who've used juniper, and that's supposed to last longer than cedar. But average cedar bed would probably last, I'm guessing, around 10 years. Ian, has that been your experience, about 10 years?
I think that's true. I mean, if we're really organized, we will, start with cedar and we'll cut the boards to size, and then we'll coat them with linseed oil and let them dry and then assemble them. But that means you can't just do the whole thing in one day. And I think that helps. And then we have done a couple gardens with juniper, which I think is supposed to be similar in price to cedar. And somebody said I think they said like 20 years and 40 years in the ground without treating them. I don't know if that's real, but
I have priced it, and I have found that it is roughly the same cost as cedar, but it's finding who has it or who is stocking it that has been the issue. Cedar is available widely, whereas juniper is not.
Yep.
On that same note, at my personal house, I use cinder blocks with the 2 spaces around, and that provides heat for my garden raised bed too. And I was just curious if anyone has tried that, because we also planted marigolds in it and it was surrounded, so you have that kind of pest protection too.
There are many, yes, you're not limited to just wood. There are a lot of material choices when it comes to building your raised beds. And with students, this might be a little more difficult, but you don't have to necessarily have any sides to your bed. You can do some mounded raised beds, but the difficulty is, and it doesn't have those physical boundaries that students can see to keep them from stepping into the soil.
And the raised beds do allow for accessibility for kids who might be in a wheelchair or mobility device as well.
They have some great raised beds that are literally, 3 or more feet off the ground too, for as well. They're almost on, well, Jane, you would probably know better than I. They're almost like on posts.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so some of the newer schools in the bond programs, if you're in Vancouver, Evergreen might have the raised elevated beds where somebody could just wheel right up to the bed. So any designs, there's lots of designs online. So if you need ideas on garden boxes, or if your high school in your area happens to have a wood shop, there might be a partnership opportunity there to have your high schools. I see Joni shaking her head. To partner with your high school students if they need a service project to work with your high schools as well.
I was just kind of curious gosh, fabulous talk. Absolutely wonderful. Does anybody collect the flower heads back in September? And then you separate the seeds and do all the deadheading, and then you have your seeds for the following year in most annuals and the perennials.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's a great point. I know, it's like, that's one of those things like, where do I
I was
stop?
waiting for you to say that.
Yes, so in the fall, if you're growing, a lot of the flowers I recommended, sunflowers, nasturtium, cosmos, zinnias, marigolds, there's many, many more, but they will, as your students are watching the life cycle of the plant, they want to regenerate. The plants want to make more of themselves, so they will go to seed. And on a dry fall day, when they have started to go to seed, it's a great time for your students to go out and collect those, put them in brown paper bags, make sure they're not damp, but label them so you know what you've collected. But then you can replant those the following year. And I'm sure you'll still end up with some volunteers that made it into the soil come springtime. They'll come up on their own. But yeah, and then the other thing too you can do to allow students to continue to see that full life cycle, taking things like lettuce or radishes, for example. We eat the leaves of the lettuce, we eat the root of the radishes, but if you leave them in the ground long enough, they will flower. And you can see how, those plants, what they're designed to do is to reproduce themselves, and they will still do that by seed. We often don't think about the fact that radishes have flowers and lettuce has flowers, and broccoli, and a lot of pollinators love all of those flowers as well. So it's always kind of nice to leave a couple of those in the garden so they can complete their entire life cycle.
Nice. And could you also speak to hardening off plants if we've started them in a classroom to go outside
Yes.
and kind of
you.
explain that? I mean,
Yes.
I don't get
Yes.
it right all the time, and I would love your
Well,
expert.
I know, and this, I will, I admit that I don't always get this right either. I'm terrible at coddling plants. So if they don't make it, they're in trouble. But to harden off a plant, that's a really good question. So if you start a seed inside, whether it's, in a little egg carton or in a pot, under grow lights, on a seed mat, however you choose to do it, or even, in a heated greenhouse, if you start a seed indoors and then it needs to be transplanted outdoors, you will, when it's time to transplant it, you need to take about a week and a half to harden it off. You're essentially getting it acclimated to the outdoor temperatures. You've been growing it in a nice, cozy, warm, well-lit environment with, the perfect amount of water that it needs every day. And so you'll start by the first couple of days, you will place those plants, those young seedlings outside in a protected environment. So maybe that's in the shade of a tree, the shade of a building, but you put them outside for a few hours. And then you slowly are increasing that amount of time that they're outside and the amount of sunlight exposure that they're getting. And then ultimately, where they can be left out even overnight. But it's a slow process of every day having them outside longer before you pull them back inside. And you do this over about a week and a half. And after that time, they've acclimated and that they will take that transition to being planted outside a lot more easily. Does that answer your question? Yeah. And that's a kind of do as I say, not necessarily do, because sometimes I forget, or they end up in the sun and I didn't realize that there's shade, it was going to be exposed so quickly. But plants are resilient and they can put up with a lot of our own errors. Any other questions? Or comments? Ian, do you have anything else you'd like to add too?
Not really. That was great. Becca, I guess, yeah, I guess if you're not getting questions, that's the main thing, that everybody's situation is different. So just kind of hearing what people are at. I think I mentioned this last time, but scarlet runner beans are these really beautiful, striking kind of purple and black beans, really big, nice for kids to handle. And I think pretty resilient. So I think if you planted them in the spring, those you come back in the fall and they're hanging as dried pods, and it's, kids are pretty excited. That's the one seed that we consistently harvest the seeds and plant them again the next season because it's so much fun.
Can I ask a question about starting seeds? When you are using, I know that's traditional to either use overhead lights to start seeds inside, or but how often do you use like a mat, and what mat do you recommend? Because I know that my mom's like a super crazy gardener and she uses a mat. She says that's maybe more important than the light up above.
Yeah, so I do use a heated seed mat when I get my seeds started in I don't know the brand of it though. I ordered it on Amazon. You could email me and I can find you the link, but that keeps the soil temperature to where it needs to be for certain seeds to germinate. And then the overhead light can be important in that if you don't have good direct overhead light, your seeds can start to get leggy. And so if you have a really good sunlight coming through a window, you can you can rotate your seedlings and you can get some sunlight through the window. But some of our windows have been coated, and so it's like a low E glass, and so you won't get the same type of light coming through that your plants need. So I learned that the hard way. So but because the house that we had moved into had that type of glass on our windows. And so I went from the house where I could start seedlings in the windows to one where I couldn't. So overhead light would be important in that case. So, and there's cheap ways of doing that. You don't have to buy some big expensive contraption. You can look up ways to have inexpensive overhead light. So, yes.
So you mentioned the soil test handout. Do you folks know of other good soil tests that students can do in a classroom without sending results, or do you not recommend that?
So with my volunteering at the Answer Clinic, which is where the public can send, questions or come in and bring plant samples and things with problems, we recommend a lab for our soil testing. A lot of the things that you can purchase on the shelf to test pH of your soil and things like that, they're not as accurate as what the labs can offer. It would be an interesting comparison if you had older students to compare, what does the test kit that we bought at Home Depot say compared to what a lab says? And what does a lab offer that's different than what we're doing here in the classroom? But yeah, the accuracy of the labs that we recommend is just superior to what you can pick up off the shelf.
What about that? It's not a soil test, but it's like seeing the composition of your soil.
Yes.
You just take some soil and put it in a jar with water and shake it up, and it settles out into layers, and it's like sand, clay,
silt. Yeah, that would be interesting to see what your soil is made up of. Do you have more of a clay soil, a sand soil? Do you have more silt in your soil? And that would be a good classroom exercise that wouldn't involve a lab, but then that would allow you to see the proportions because all of our soil is made up of clay, sand, and silt. And it's just the amount of proportions that you have to determine where you are at on that. There's a soil triangle, whether you're more clay, more sand, more silt. So. And more clay would mean your soil holds moisture longer. And more sand means your soil drains faster. So that's where and silt is even smaller than clay, right? Now I'm trying to,
I don't remember. Sorry.
I'm trying to remember back to our soil class. Yeah. But yeah, it's all in how the water moves through. But then also depends on the structure of your soil and how the water permeates through the little spaces that are left in your soil.
Um,
With just a few minutes left, I want to just make sure we have time to make sure that everybody had a chance to log into the attendance poll. If you have any challenges with that, I'll put my email in the chat box and you can let me know. Also, I want to introduce Mark Watron, who's on the call today. He will be our next presenter in a couple of weeks. So we look forward to hearing from Mark and connecting what we're learning to our curriculum. And he's an amazing resource from the Battleground Schools, and happy to have him on. Any other questions with the last couple minutes we have?
I have a question about how you protect your space if it's not enclosed within a fenced area from just outside tampering or whatnot, or how much luck or success you've had with that.
So I had a garden space. It wasn't in a school, it was at a church, but it wasn't fenced at all. Anyone from the neighborhood could have accessed it. And we found that putting up a sign saying, you know, we were growing specifically for a food bank. And so we posted on there, you know, this garden is producing food for our local food bank. That kept people from going in and causing any damage or taking anything from the garden. I would imagine a school environment could become somewhat similar. You know, your local students are growing this for, you know, for their learning or for their cafeteria or whatever it is, and just reminding people that this is a student space. I'm not saying that would help everyone stay out, but it might be that little bit of positive encouragement to leave it alone.
Yeah, and I'll point to Illahee Elementary as a great example. They have
That's
signs.
a good point.
Yeah, signs for when a garden is ready to harvest. She puts a sign out in the bed that's with a green sign that says ready to harvest, help yourself, or a red stop sign saying, please don't touch, this is still growing, it's not ready to harvest yet. And it's just a series of laminated cards, and she does a great sign with providing some educational signs in your garden too. Like a big one with the students is being wary of bugs. And we don't want the kids to hurt the bugs that are in the gardens, and so they can learn. So having identification signs with what the bugs are or the spiders that are visiting your garden, things like that really help with the ownership of the space with your students. And if you need to see an example, Illahee on the east side of Vancouver is a great example. She's always got signs out in her space.
And they will be one of our school garden tour sites this spring that we'll tell you about at our next session. So.
Any last questions for Becca?
When you were talking about the structure of soil, I just sort of wanted to talk about a thing that that I learned on my personal journey, and just like sort of really wanting fluffy soil and very fine soil. And so we would, you know, dig up, you think that like if you dig up and just fluff the heck out of, you know, the ground, like tilling it basically, that this fluffy soil that you're feeling is what you're getting. But really once water goes through it, all those little particles compact, and it's like, you know, being close to the water at the beach where the sand is just super hard. All those it's so weird, like we just fluffed this soil up, why is it rock hard? And we realized that some of that we were destroying any structure, so any like little air pockets and little kind of microbial pathways and, you know, structure that the soil was building, we had just ruined it by completely pulverizing the soil. And so we're trying not to like micro till it, you know, and kind of layer things. And even sometimes, you know, instead of pulling a plant out at the end of the season, clipping it off,
Yes.
so that the roots stay in there, right, and kind of build those little air pathways and stuff. So that's been something for us.
That's really good advice, and it saves you time too. If it's not a diseased plant, you can just cut it at soil level and leave the root zone in, and it will decompose over time and add more organic matter to your soil. But that's, yeah, tilling your soil or over tilling it can in the long run create, you lose your soil structure, and then you create a hard pan type surface underneath your garden beds. And to the reverse of that, when you're gardening in raised beds with purchased soil or bulk soil mixes, it is very fluffy because I think they think that's what home gardeners want, and then it ends up draining really, really fast. And so there's always going to be some sort of challenge. So when you're gardening in those bulk mixes, learning how to work with that and add that organic matter over time to create soil structure is what will help with that as well. That's been my own personal in my new garden space, battling the too fast draining soil.
I actually have one question, and that's about the metal using troughs. There's no leaching or concern of leaching and metals into the soil at all?
Not to my knowledge. One of Ian's gardens that he supervises is a brand new garden, and it's almost entirely in those metal troughs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I certainly haven't heard it. I have heard sort of mixed possibility about cinder blocks being made with fly ash, like what's made from burning coal or something that goes in cinder blocks. So there's a possibility there, but I don't know about that with metal. We haven't heard it at all.
I think it's maybe the type of metal that it's used is safer, or it's not.
I think plain metal is just like metal. It's just like a rock. It's fine. You know, it's just minerals, but those are galvanized. So I think that's zinc basically that's covering that.
Yes.
I just have one more question out of a million. You mentioned a date on 3/21. What did I write that wrong? On March 21st?
Yep, March 21st, we will have a separate work session that you will all get an invitation to if you're interested, with John Muir-Laws. He is an expert in nature journaling, and he will be hosting a session for the Lower Columbia Nature Network for environmental educators and teachers to help you learn how to use that as a tool for kids outside. We heard from one of our partners that, you know, post-COVID, kids' skills are at so many different levels. So some can write, some can draw, some can't. So using nature journaling is a really specific way of using whatever skills they have to track their observations and what they're seeing outside, whether it's a garden or with a tree or just, you know, walking around the grass on your campus. So it'll be a great session. We'll send that information out later. Okay, it's the bottom of the hour, and I bet you all would like to go eat dinner and see your families. We can't thank you enough for joining us today. We're really grateful for your time and for all that you're doing for your students. We know that you have lots on your plates, but taking kids outside, we know, provides so many benefits. So we're excited that you're joining us, and we look forward to seeing you with Mark's session, which will be on a Tuesday, not a Monday. Too many holidays in February, but we'll send reminders. And if you have any questions, please just let us know. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Keep well.
Thank you.
And thank you, Becca.
Yeah, that's
Oh my
fun.
gosh, so many notes.
Yeah, that was really great, Becca. That was.
Thank